Hi, I'm Peggy Haymes. I'm a licensed professional counselor in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I want to talk a little bit today about the 5 myths of grief. The first myth is that there's only one kind of grief, and that is when someone we love dies. Now that's a kind of grief, but that is far from being the only kind of grief. Often we grieve when a pet dies. In fact, pet loss grief can be devastating for people because pets are so intertwined with our lives. You may have seen Uncle Joe twice a year. You didn't have that much of a relationship with him. But your dog Spot, you saw and took care of every single day. And he greeted you when you came home. That kind of absence leads to huge grief. We can grieve when marriages end, even if we are the ones initiating the ending. Because by and large, when we get married, we don't get married with the hope and dream that somewhere down the road we're going to get divorced. Now, when we get married, we have hopes and dreams for where this relationship's going to lead, what our lives are going to look like. When the marriage ends, that also means the end of those dreams, and that's a loss. We grieve when we lose jobs, and for a lot of people, losing a job also means losing an identity. Who am I if I am not this person? Who am I if I am not a lawyer? Who am I if I am not a salesperson? It's really hard. It's a powerful grief to have to go back and reclaim that sense of identity. We also grieve for what we never got. And sometimes that's the trickiest grief of all, because it's easy to say, okay, I had this person in my life and I don't have them in my life anymore and I miss them. But grieving what you never got is a little more nebulous, but it's also very real. For example, I often work with people who had really painful childhoods. Their home as a child was not a safe place. Their parents, instead of being loving, were very abusive to them, whether emotionally or physically or sexually abusive. Part of their healing journey is in being able to grieve what they didn't get. Every child has a birthright that we should all have a safe family. That when we are at home, when we are with mom or with dad, that we do not have to worry about our safety, and that in fact, they're the ones who are going to protect us. And when we don't have that, that becomes a loss. Or maybe you had dreams for your life, and you realize they're not going to come true. We make jokes about the midlife crisis being, the affair or the convertible. But part of that midlife crisis is the recognition that some of the dreams we had are not going to come true. Now, if you're, say, 57 and you're not married, now, there's no rule that says that you may not get married at some point. But you're not going to have, probably, unless you live a really long time, you're not going to be celebrating that 50th wedding anniversary. Or you're not going to have the family that you'd planned on having. One of the things that parents of special needs kids have to go through is the grief that their children are not going to follow the path that they'd envisioned and dreamed. And they have to grieve the loss of the child they thought they were going to have. It doesn't mean that they don't desperately and deeply love the child they do have. But there's also a loss that comes with it. Myth number 2 is there's only one way to grieve. And that says that these are the things that you need to do to grieve, and you can check them all off the list, and it will be done. Well, one size doesn't fit all in clothes, certainly not in clothes, and it doesn't fit in grief either. We're all individuals, and we all have to find our individual paths. Some people express the feelings and emotions of grieving by dancing or creating music or writing or journaling. A lot of my clients have used journaling in really powerful ways to express their grief. Sometimes we just need to give grief a voice. I had a friend many years ago, as an older woman, and her husband had died of a progressive and very long and very cruel disease. And she had been with him every step of the way. And then her son died unexpectedly. And I asked her one day, I said, "How are you doing?" Because I was really concerned about her. And she said, "Sometimes I just stand in the middle of my house and scream." Now, fortunately, she lived out in the country, so neighbors were not calling the cops. But sometimes people just need to wail, to scream, to let it out. When my father was dying, one of the ways that I grieved was by building a retaining wall. Now, you're probably not going to find that in any counseling textbooks, but he also had been dying very slowly, dying by inches, as my brother said. And I was spending every night with him at hospice. I'd go at lunchtime and spend the night, go back home at breakfast. And then I worked on that retaining wall. Now, it was something that needed to be done, but it was something I needed to do. I needed something very concrete. I needed hard physical labor, picking up those heavy bags of sand and topsoil and gravel and moving those bricks. That's part of how I worked out my grief. So we all have to find what ways work for us. One of the things with building the retaining wall when my dad was in hospice was, at that point, there wasn't much I could do for him except just be there. Rub his head, call the nurse if he was in too much pain. And being present is a huge gift, don't get me wrong. But I knew I also needed something concrete where at the end of the day, I could look at it and say, I did this. I accomplished this. So there's more than one way to grieve. Now, the third myth about grieving is that grief is something you get through. I'm coming to the point that I wish we could outlaw the word closure, because for most people, or for many people, that means I won't have to be sad anymore. I won't grieve anymore. It means my grief is wrapped up in this nice little package, and I can put it on the shelf and not worry about it anymore. And it just doesn't work that way. In truth, closure means recognizing that a chapter has come to an end. There's this wonderful line from The Prince of Tides where Tom Wingo is lamenting to his wife that he's lost his job. He was a football coach, a high school football coach, and that was his dream job. It's what he really wanted to do, and now he's lost it. And he tells his wife, "My life is over." And his wife says, "No, Tom, your life isn't over. That chapter of your life is over. Now you have to decide what the next chapter is going to be." That's what closure is. It's recognizing this chapter's over and I have to start a new chapter. That doesn't mean that we don't grieve. Grief strikes unexpectedly. You can be 10 years down the road from a loss and hear a song or see a movie or just walk outside on a particular kind of a day that reminds you of someone you loved and have lost. And in that moment, in that split second, it can feel like the loss just happened. That doesn't mean that you've done it wrong. That doesn't mean that you haven't healed. It means that grief is something that we never really finish doing. Grief is something that we learn to live with. And part of the task, part of the healing task of grieving is that our lives get bigger. I've heard people describe it as, when I first lost this person, the hole in my heart was the only thing that was there. But now, as I've grieved and I've healed and I've journeyed through this pain, and now my heart is bigger. The hole is still there, and it will always be there. It's just not the only thing anymore. Grief isn't a task that we do and then we're done with it. Grief is something we live through and live with. And healing means not shutting up the grief in this nice, neat little box. Healing means finding the place in the tapestry of our lives where this thread is going to go. The thread will always be there. It just won't be the whole picture anymore. Speaking of task, another myth of grieving is that the 5 stages of grief are little stair steps, and you need to move from one to the other, to the next, to the next. You know, once you've done shock and denial, you check that off, and now you get to move on to anger. And then you check that off, and then you go on to the next thing, and you check it off. And nothing could be further from the truth. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross gave us those stages, and she never, ever intended for them to be seen as stair steps. I like the word stages has gotten such a funky meaning to it now that I like to talk about aspects of grieving. As Anne Lamott writes, grief is like a lazy Susan, and you may be serene and at peace and full of acceptance one day, and then 5 minutes later you are so enraged you could break boards just by looking at them. That's the way it goes. Our emotions aren't orderly. They're jumbled. Understanding that there are some things that are common to grief is helpful. It just helps us know, gosh, I'm not going crazy. I'm just grieving. I sometimes tell clients that grief is like being parachuted into a foreign country where you don't know the language and you don't know the customs. but you have to learn to make your way. One more myth about grieving, and that is you're doing really well if you don't cry. I mean, isn't that what we say about people after funerals? You know, we'll talk about family members. They'll say, she did so well. She didn't even cry. Like there's something wrong with crying. Crying honors the loss that we've had. And sometimes that loss can feel so painful that we feel like that if we ever let ourselves start, we will never stop crying. You know, I see this especially with people who are grieving the childhoods that they had and shouldn't have had. You know, those childhoods where they just received lots of pain and abuse, and they had to keep everything locked up for such a long time. And they are afraid that if they ever let themselves start grieving, they will never ever stop. Well, when we let ourselves start crying, if we let ourselves start expressing the emotions, it's not always fun. And sometimes we do get up the next morning and we got the big puffy eyes and our head is all stopped up and we feel like a truck's run over us. But we don't cry forever. I have yet to see a situation where someone started crying and flooded the world. Yeah, I for 10 years or so now, I've staffed grief workshops. And people come because it's a place where they can express these emotions. And sometimes people cry for the first time, and sometimes people cry a lot. You know, we buy Kleenex in bulk. But nobody ever is unable to stop crying. It's just whatever tears are there, they come out and then we're done. Now, there is a situation in which the shock of grief can be a really wonderful gift. That initial shock can be what enables us to do what needs to be done. For example, we may need to make travel plans. We may need to make funeral arrangements. There are things that have to be taken care of. And that shock allows us to do that. Because we couldn't do what we need to do if we were weeping and wailing for 3 days. A few years back, I was hit by a car when I was biking. The car came up behind me and hit me. And I don't know if I was in physical shock when I woke up, but I know I was in emotional shock because I woke up on the pavement and the EMTs were there and they got me into the ambulance. And I have to tell you, I was chatty Cathy in that ambulance. I was just having a good old time. You know, here I had just been hit by a car. They didn't know the extent of my injuries. And I had some serious injuries. But I was just chatting up a storm with the EMT. And then when they got me into the ER, I just thanked the nurses over and over again because they managed to get my bike shorts off without having to cut them off. And, you know, I told them these are my most expensive shorts and they don't come cheap. So, gosh, guys, you're really good. Thanks for doing that for me. Well, that emotional shock gave me the distance to start absorbing this new reality bit by bit. I didn't have to take it in all at once. That I'd been hit, that I was injured, that I was going to have a pretty significant rehab. it gave me some breathing space. And that's what that initial shock does. Now, if you never get beyond that, then that's a different conversation. If you never get beyond that, then that means you're kind of shutting things down and you're not allowing yourself to grieve. And here's the thing about grief is, well, I promised you 5 myths. Here's the 6th one. Call it a bonus. Grief doesn't just go away. If we ignore it, if we don't pay attention to it, if we decide we're not going to feel it because feeling it hurts, it doesn't go away no matter how many years. And I have worked with people who were coming to terms with grief from things that happened 20 and 30 and 40 years ago. It doesn't go away. We just carry it inside. And that becomes one more piece of heaviness, one more piece that keeps us from having the kind of lives that we want to live. It keeps us from moving forward and creating the next chapter. So I hope this has been helpful to you. If you have a question, feel free to leave a comment, or you can email me, Peggy@peggyhaymes.com. If you're in the Winston-Salem area and you'd like to do some work on your own grief, give me a call or shoot me an email, and I'll be glad to talk with you about the possibilities of doing that.